Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and welcome back to the Good Life Podcast. I am thankful today to be joined by Ryan Pugliese. Ryan is a husband, father, and history teacher in New Jersey, and he has a great Substack called Pugliese's Paideia, which is where I discovered one of his articles not too long ago that led to the opportunity for our discussion today. So, Ryan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, the article in particular that you wrote that I really appreciated is called "The Modern Home is Anti-Catechism," which we will get to here in a moment. But first of all, Ryan, tell us about your background and what led you into to pursue education.
So, what's very interesting about my journey to education is my family knew that I was going to be a teacher before I did. I had envisioned myself going into law. I was always very interested in politics and history, and I thought, okay, looking at history, looking at the American founding, the American Revolution, the founding fathers, many of them operating as lawyers as a catapult to political prominence, the ability to incorporate rhetoric, history, politics, philosophy into their writings and their goals. So I very much felt myself going down that path. I thought that I would emulate folks like John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and the like. So went off to college fully intending to go into law. About halfway through, my stepfather comes to visit me on campus and we're having dinner. And I'm telling him about my summer job where I was welcoming new students to the university and how it was really fulfilling, guiding them and giving them the advice and the input. And then he looks me dead in the eyes and he goes, Ryan, you know you're supposed to be a teacher, right? That's your calling. That's what you're supposed to do. And I'm sitting there and I'm telling him, no, 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 I'm going into law. Like I would like teaching sounds interesting, but that's not for me. And he goes, Ryan, when you were 4 years old, you made a teddy bear at Build-A-Bear and you named him Education Teacher Pugliese. You've always been a teacher. We've known for a while. You're the last one to know. So just to kind of humor him, I took a couple of education courses and it finally clicked. So I ended up applying to grad school. I got my master's in K-12 social studies education. And so for the past 9 years, public and private education. And while I've had moments of doubt and fear and anxiety about it, I have come to realize that education, I do believe, is my vocation. I do believe that I'm called to be in the classroom.
And you also, of course, write as well, and you, as your Substack indicates, you've done a lot of good reading. So, in the interest of just learning a little bit more still about how you were formed up to this point in your life, who would you say are the strongest influences? Now, they could be people you know or people that you just read, but who are some of the strongest influences you've had in your life?
So the obvious answer, at least inherently in my moral character and mentality, are my parents. My mother, who endured a great deal of suffering with my biological father and the challenges of their relationship to raise me, teaching me about grit and determination and perseverance in the face of adversity. My stepfather, who taught me the value of hard work and diligence, and the idea that if you want something, you go for it. It could be anything. It could be athletically inclined. It could be intellectual pursuits. But if you want it, you have to put in the work. So on a personal level, my parents are that big influence. And then with regards to my writing and my interest in philosophy, history, theology, etc., over the past couple of years, the two most notable thinkers are Rod Dreher, the author of The Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, Living in Wonder, and then Yoram Hazony, whose book about conservatism, a rediscovery, really helped me orient myself about what it means when we talk about these terms, conservative, liberal, etc. So I'm seeing
Okay.
that on multiple levels in my own life, those thinkers really making me assess my perception of the world.
So you originally intended to pursue the path of John Adams, and instead you pursued the path of Plutarch. Uh,
I think
by way,
that is a fair assessment. Yeah. I never thought about it that way.
well, not uh, probably not achieve the level of Plutarch
No, no.
yet, but as a teacher and someone who loves history, which I can appreciate, there is something very noble in that. And actually, yesterday I was thinking after some of the, looking at different men and women running for office, and some of whom have espoused positions, public positions that lean very much towards socialism. I was in a conversation with someone, and it was an older adult, and she said, "I don't understand how people can elect someone who's promising all of these supposedly free things." And I said, "Well, because their economics was probably not wedded to history
Mhm.
at all. Because if economics teaching all of these teaching what can be abstract ideas is not taught with the background of history and what actually happens when you put fallacious ideas, which you can perhaps manipulate to look like they work on paper, but in real life don't work. Unless you have those together, it doesn't make sense to share. Well, excuse me. The abstract ideas, uh, right or wrong, can make some sort of sense in a kind of sophist vein, but when you have the background of history to show what actually happens, and not just economics, but any type of ideology that says man can become God, unless you actually have strong historical presentation along with that, it's not gonna. I mean, people they'll be led to believe anything. So our profession, it seems like what you're doing is very important.
And I would wholeheartedly agree with that, where I had a professor in college who explained to me that he viewed history. It was interesting because he was riffing off of the Gospels, and he was talking about how much like how Christ talks about being salt and light of the earth. He mentioned that history was the salt of the humanities, where on its own as an abstract study, it can be very interesting, but as the salt that enriches other disciplines, it works in tandem with many. So you're bringing up economics is absolutely a very good point. Is if we look at the history of nations and the economic policies that they have pursued, whether it's capitalism, socialism, communism, mercantilism, you name it, historical context is absolutely essential. If you want to go into law, historical precedent is absolutely essential. Understanding the trajectory of past societies and that historical context is absolutely critical in so many different disciplines that might overlap with history, and they're enhanced by it. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
And it is a gift that can be overlooked, as I know we didn't talk about it, but I know as a history teacher you've had the question, as I did every year multiple times, what is the point of us having to learn this stuff? It's almost like trying to explain it. The answer to that question is like answering the question, why must you have flour to make bread?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you just make bread without flour? It's the base that forms the foundation of most of what we learn. Because whether you're teaching literature or science and even math, although that relationship may be a bit more strained, still, if you look at different mathematicians even, and what they were doing in the time and place in the world where they lived, you can understand a lot about why a discovery either was very important or why it perhaps didn't have as great an effect as the originator thought that it would. So I guess we can sum this all up by saying history is a very important pursuit for people and certainly for teachers.
Absolutely.
So why did you call your Substack, why did you title it Pugliese's Paideia? Obviously, your last name. That's understandable. But talk about the word Paideia.
So the idea of Paideia is it dates back to ancient Greece, and it is this conversation about education when it comes to value formation and the formation of the whole child or the whole student. Where so often when we have conversations about modern education, it is you need this so you can get a good job and you can set yourself up for some sort of financial success. Whereas if we were to poll your average Athenian citizen of relative respectable birth and education, if we were to ask them the purpose of education, it is to prepare someone for, the realities of life, citizenship, independence, moral and civic duties, if you will. When I started teaching, I started in a private Catholic school. One of the things that I found immensely valuable was, even though I myself was not Catholic, the heavy focus on the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. And so, dignity of life, the value of work, the innate dignity of human beings in general, all made in the image of God. While not every student was Catholic, it informed them about what was important. Because the college acceptance certainly is something that students want to focus on. Those that are interested in a particular profession, absolutely. But a paideia is in its entirety the formation of the self. And as a Christian, paideia towards the moral order and the value system through which, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ made flesh was part of. So paideia prepares the whole student, the whole child, rather than a checklist of you are proficient in the subject, you move on to the next grade, good luck getting a job.
So that concept of moving on, the checklist and moving on, where did that come from? How did that become such a big thing in our country, Western society, however far you want to take that?
So the two areas that I think of, at least, and this is a little bit more recent, but I think most significantly, the Industrial Revolution, as well as the Progressive Era in the United States, where when you think of what a modern school looks like, you have the bell ringing about passing time between the classes. You sit in your assigned rows, you raise your hand to answer questions, to go to the bathroom. Very regimented and very structured. With the advent of an industrial economy, you needed obedient workers that could perform their tasks in a minimally disruptive way. The assembly line, the idea of working in the mill, the working in the mines. Certainly, you would want people to be able to read, write, and perform basic mathematical functions, but you're dealing with middle management at best. It was geared towards an industrial economy where you were a cog in the machine. And then with the advent of the Progressive Era, your reformers like John Dewey and their idea of the laboratories of democracy that schools could be, the involvement of government and larger social institutions in the formation of children, it separated children from their families and geared them more towards a collectivist enterprise.
That's interesting, because right now I teach my two middle kids who are in middle school, and we're covering the Progressive Era. So in fact, just behind me, can't see it very well, and of course this is audio, so listeners won't be able to see it. But there's elements about the different progressive era presidents, and the book by Dr. Richard Gamble over at Hillsdale College, The War for Righteousness. He talks about progressive Christianity and its role in pushing nationalism and kind of just how that mentality of efficiency becoming the primary goal of all things was so harmful, and actually led us partially into World War One, because President Wilson believed that just as the United States had supposedly perfected some of its government through the democratic process, that we could actually aid the perfection of other countries by getting rid of the monarchical power and bringing in this synthesis of Americanism and American efficiency and God's kingdom together, which is I shudder just to put those two words or those two phrases in the same sentence. I feel like I need to wash my mouth out. But it is yes. So that is interesting. You were talking about that, and you also reminded me of John Taylor Gatto.
Mm-hmm.
His book, The Underground History of American Education. He talks a lot about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, go ahead.
Well, no, it was funny is that we were on a drive up to Maine for a wedding of a family member, and we actually had the audiobook of it playing, because in our household, having conversations with about our 2-year-old and what our future looks like with our son, the ideas of what we experienced in education and our concerns, we're having a lot of very serious family conversations about 5, 10, 15 years from now. What does our family look like? What choices are we making for our son and for any future children we might be blessed with? And this notion of a one size fits all on a surface level just is factually impossible with education. But also additionally, being able to try and distinguish this idea of the perfectibility of man with the eternal promises of God. Man's nature, if you are to believe Scripture, is fundamentally sinful and fallen from the eating of the fruit in the Garden of Eden. If we are to take that as something that is to be true, and I do believe Scripture to be true,
yes,
that fundamentally on a molecular level is something that you cannot separate. You cannot separate sin and fallenness and vice from human nature. So this idea that through a scientific process or an administrative process you can perfect human nature is deeply problematic and has led to crises and abuse and trauma and suffering across the globe over the course of decades and centuries.
Yes, even down to poor foreign policy decisions in our lifetimes.
Mm.
So, I mean, it continues, and the same goes also though for the home. And your article talks about this. You said again in the title that the modern home is anti-catechism. Most people think of a catechism as just something that, a series of questions and answers. Now, granted, catechisms themselves have fallen out of favor due to, a number of factors. But in your article, you're not just talking about homes being places that are against questions and answers. So help us understand then, how do you define a catechism, and how does that differ from what most people think of when they hear the word catechism.
So I think most people, when they hear the word catechism, they're probably thinking of a furry feline that is a pet in a household. Catechism is not a word that is often bandied about these days. If you have any understanding of the word, you're probably thinking of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the specific teachings of the Catholic Church that have been passed down for hundreds of years via the Vatican. My understanding of catechism is where it overlaps with the idea of paideia, where it is a moral value foundation of one's life, aligned with some type of higher moral value system. So the catechism that I envision is a good, proper, healthy catechism is aligned with God's word and the natural laws of reality established by our divine creator. So that is a positive catechism. An anti-catechism is one that would work against that value formation and would run oppositionally to those intents.
So then that requires us to think about our homes in a broader way than most of us are accustomed to thinking, because we usually think of the home as a physical object, a house or an apartment that is a place that is hopefully comfortable, or it has comfortable furniture, and it has the food we need, and it has beds in which we sleep. And that's it. So the home is a place of recuperation and physical nourishment. And that's about all. I mean, it's this building that houses these things, whereas the school is the building that houses what you learn, and if you attend church, that houses the place that you worship. So we're used to thinking of these things as totally separate categories, and you're talking about the home in a different way, that it actually has formative power.
Mm-hmm.
So how is a home a place of formation?
What I think is interesting, and I'm going to work backwards to answer the question here, is if we're talking about formation or learning, in 2025, most people view it like you say, is that specific geographical locations have specific purposes in mind, where school is for education, church is for worship, the home is for sleeping. When I talk to my students, what I normally am able to get out of them when we have conversations is they are able to acknowledge that learning happens in many different areas, where the job that they work at part-time has taught them things such as time management, organization, responsibility. Their sports that they play have taught them cooperation and teamwork and the idea of collaborative enterprises. Learning and formation takes place everywhere. It is not simply relegated to specific geographical locations. But the home, whether it is an apartment, a townhouse, a condo, you name it, wherever you lay your head at night, the home is the foundation of everything else, in which parents and children, from the inception, that family teaches those foundational values from birth. My son is 2 years old, and he has learned in our home things about prayer, about appropriate behaviors, about how one acts. It is not something that you offload to others, but the home is the whole thing. Children are sponges. They observe, they listen, and they tend to repeat and replicate. You're a father, you can also most likely attest to this. If you are in a home in which physical violence, verbal threats, shattering plates being thrown at walls is a common occurrence, that behavior is going to be repeated through the generations. It's not just schools. The foundational components of our identity are rooted in the home more than anywhere else.
Therefore, if the home is not well cared for, and I don't mean that it's clean as a pen all the time. But if it is not crafted, if it is not cultivated as a place of strengthening, nourishing the soul as well as the body, then it's not a matter of it either being good or being neutral. What I'm hearing you say is it's going to form in one way or another. Is that correct?
That is absolutely.
And this is where I think that the concept of paideia is needed, because often we as parents think that when our children are not at home, when we are not around them, when they are at school or with friends or at a job when they're older or something like that, that they're out from us at the time, and as long as they don't come home physically bruised and anything like that, then we're okay. As long as their bodies are protected. But that's the bare minimum of what we are called to do as parents, because we're responsible for their formation wherever they go.
Hmm. It's very interesting because one of the subjects that I teach is criminal justice. And so right now, my students are in the middle of their juvenile law unit. And what we are going to be discussing the next time that we meet is the idea of role models and juvenile delinquency, where as a child develops, they become the amalgamation of the people they spend their most time with. One of the earliest indicators of future potential criminality is the social interactions children have and at what age they partake in certain behaviors. So in that sense, positive role models in the family, and this might not even be the immediate family, it could be grandparents, third cousins twice removed, it could be the coach of the local team on the travel team that your kid plays, whatever. The positive, healthy adult role models children interact with set them up to interpret the world they are living in particular ways. Things that are important, things they should strive for, things that they should avoid. And as such, the home should be a place of intentionality. It isn't just the standard nowadays where the child goes off to school from 7:30 to 3:30. Maybe they have sports or they come home and it's homework. Everyone's on a screen at dinner. You watch TV maybe together for an hour before they go to bed and you barely interact. That is what I would argue to be a disordered household that is acting as that anti-catechism that long term will create problems for that family and for the broader community as a whole.
When we think of the concept of a human soul, and going back to C.S. Lewis, his famous quote, and this is not an exact replication of it, but where he said that eventually every person we see will either one day look like a god that we would be tempted to worship, or something so hideous that we could not stand to be in its presence. Essentially, either with Christ in the new heavens and new earth, or in eternal punishment in hell. Knowing that, then everything we give that child, when we read something, and certainly when we give a phone or something like that, we're giving them the equivalent of spiritual nuclear power in one way or another, either destructive or instructive. So that is and you go on to talk about that when you speak of screens and how and their role in colonizing our homes. You even, I mean, you call screens the new priests of the household. So how do screens discipline us? How do they affect who we become, and especially how do they affect who kids become?
So in addition to criminal justice, I'm not teaching this semester, but I teach psychology. One of the things that I talk to my students about is the development of the brain and various neurotransmitters and hormones that lead to development, particularly young children, adolescents into adulthood. You become you become the person you are by the actions you take. There's all of those old, I'm straining to remember exactly what, like, how the quote goes, but it's mind your thoughts because they become your words, mind your words because they become your character, mind your character because it becomes your destiny. Some nature of that. The choices that we make, if a child is in front of a screen and they are mindlessly scrolling, their attention span is being impeded, their social development is being hindered, their sense of reality is being warped. Where observing in the past how my students have operated with technology, the virtual worlds are their real world. It used to be that we would sit there and say to students, to children, that you need to focus on the real world right now. Like, put your video game down, put your cell phone down, come back to the real world. It's become so saturated in childhood, at least from what I've witnessed, that the virtual world for many of the students is the real world. Their apps and their texting and their FaceTiming, that is their reality. When they come to our real world, that is a break from reality. That is shifting everything about how they're perceiving the world around them. Screens become de facto everything. Their line of communication, their sources of entertainment, their ability to interact with the world around them, it's all funneled through the screen. You're impeding development on multiple fronts if screens are incorporated so heavily in a child's life. I'm a huge fan of Jonathan Haidt and his previous book, where he's talking about the anxious generation. I had that pre-ordered for months, and I absolutely love it because even though it's from a very much a psychologist, social scientist perspective, the data that he is presenting confirms what teachers and parents have known, is that the generations that are now coming up are being disordered by their technology use. It's a serious concern.
I'm tempted to go and burrow further into that crevice because there are significant problems certainly with that. But I think, I mean, certainly anyone who has questions or who doubts what we're talking about, because, you're a teacher, you teach history and psychology and criminal justice, and I'm history teacher and pastor, they think, well, you guys just, yeah, we've read, but if anybody's, if anybody doubts that, they can read Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Anxious Generation, for themselves and see that this is not just, these are not just random opinions, but this is quite a few studies that have been done just presenting life as it is right now. And, in contrast to that, though, we're not bound to do, as parents, we're not bound to do everything the way the rest of the world does it. We actually have agency in this, and we have agency in what our children will receive in how they are formed. So what would you say, and I know, I mean, so you have a son who's two, but you also have students every day. How would you suggest, for what can parents do to start right now in the way of coming out of letting the screen catechize your kids, letting those disorder your kids, to just begin to craft some order in the home?
So, talking about the personal responsibility of parents specifically. So, my son just turned 2, like I previously mentioned. For most of his life thus far, screens have not really been a factor in his life. We've never been the family that is like, oh, we're just gonna put on the TV because he's 6 months old and we have to go do something in another room. We intentionally were doing whatever we could to not expose him to screens. Around, like, I'd say about 20 months, we started introducing some screen time. We took a look at low stimulation, minimalistic, educational content that would be incorporated at designated specific times. So, I grew up in the era of Saturday morning cartoons, and I remember Saturday morning I would wake up, I'd get myself a bowl of super sugary cereal, and I would sit down, and for 3 hours I'm watching Pokemon, I'm watching Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm watching Digimon, I'm watching Beyblades, I'm watching all that. That set me up for the entire day where I was already in that screen orientation. That is not how we operate. So for about half hour a day, we'll have very specific screen time usage. And we are very clear about, we're going to stop this now. We're going to go sit down. We're going to have dinner as a family. And before bed, we're not going to be on our screens. That's just not what we're doing. Is that before he goes down at night, we read for 15 minutes, half an hour, however long. We just keep reading if he wants to. We do our prayers. We go to bed. So at a fundamental level, it is intentionality with this, because I can understand the argument for technology being beneficial. So at that level, you want to start foundationally early on. With students in the classroom, I have classes of 25, 30 students. So for their phones are in designated pouches. We have Chromebooks that they will use for specific assignments, but the goal is very much tangible interactions, where it's pen and paper. It is conversations about historical topics that can be enhanced with technology, but technology is not the end goal. It is a tool to be used sporadically, intentionally. It is not supposed to colonize their minds completely.
Hmm. Well, that is certainly helpful in a couple of ways. And one of those is the fact that you are not just saying, burn it all, throw it all in the river, and live in the good old days of the 1830s.
Mhm.
So you're actually saying that there is a legitimate place for this, but it should be purposeful, and we should be purposeful in how we pursue it. Now, that's just one way in which we allow our homes to be disordered, if we allow it to go to seed. But also, you talk about scheduling, and particularly over scheduling. You call it the false religion of busyness, or also the gospel of activity. Now, one of the things I find really interesting about your writing in this article is, throughout, you put these in the trappings of religious terms, not just for effect, but because there is, like when you talk about the gospel of activity, the word gospel meaning good news, and many think that doing things is, having your kids involved in more is the way. That is the way, the truth, and the life, rather than an alternative. And again, the alternative is not sit home on a couch meditating piously on the Psalms all day, every day. But unpack that a little bit about how busyness is a false religion.
So I think that what's interesting is if we're talking about intentionality, and I try to assume I assume the best in people with the choices they make generally. I actually think that the root of this is actually a very noble intention, which is a love of children and a desire to see them succeed. Where there's the idea that, idle hands are the devil's playthings, where a child's mind needs to be occupied and organized and directed in particular ways. And so having um, let's say weightlifting at 6 a.m. before school because they're in season, and then they have football practice, and then after football they have homework, and then after homework they have their piano recital, and then after that is dinner, and then it's bed, and they repeat. The goal is noble, to be able to support your children and ensure success. So I believe that it is well intentioned, but efficiency and accomplishment cannot be the sole foundation of one's parental instincts. You can't parent out of fear, and I have been guilty of that myself, where I tend to worry. I was the kid when Finding Nemo came out and I saw it, I was like, no, the dad's got a good point. The dad's doing it right. So fear cannot be that foundation of everything. So sitting there and allowing children to explore, to make mistakes, to not be consumed by checking every box to ensure that they get into a good college and are set up. Sometimes you have to take the training wheels off, let children explore and make mistakes, rather than put them on the altar of a busy schedule.
Which requires a bit more faith. And also, as parents, a bit more sacrifice. I mean, on one hand, there's the sacrifice that we can see of taking our kids around to a lot of things. We think that that's a sacrifice, but I've known of some parents who've said after about, 1 month of summertime, they said, I am so ready for my kids to go back to school and get back in the regular routine. And the regular routine being what you just said: school, after school activities, other things going on, where the kids were only at home interacting a couple of hours at most a day. And that, I had one pastor that I know, he's been in ministry for over 4 decades. And he said, he told me, kids know if their parents not only love them, they know if their parents want them around, if their parents like being around them. And if a kid knows that my parents enjoy me, they will themselves be much more prone to enjoying their parents, quirks and all. And everybody knows the generation gap is real, that parents have quirks and kids have to learn to deal with their parents' quirks just like parents deal with kids' quirks. But there's something to be said for enjoying your kids and learning. I mean, it does take it takes work, is my point. It's not something that happens naturally.
Hmm.
But Scripture says in Zephaniah chapter 3 that God delights over us. He rejoices over us with singing. And I don't know that, I'll say it like this. I believe that a lot of homes where you see parents wishing that their grown kids, that they had more time to spend, that they could spend more time with their adult kids. I'm not going to say every instance, but in many instances, it's true that when those kids were younger and in the home, that there was not a lot of mutual delight in each other. and a willingness and sacrifice to just spend time doing things together rather than, well, let's try to entertain ourselves while we've got to go through this unpleasantness of living in the same home. And I know everybody gets on each other's nerves. That's not what I'm talking about. But
Mm.
anyway, I didn't mean to go on a tear there, that because this I'm actually trying to ask you questions and not just talk myself. But
No, I appreciate it because I think it's interesting where I had the realization the other day where I had a rough day at work. I had a rough week at work last week, and I was coming home exhausted and feeling defeated. And if you have a 2-year old, anyone who knows a 2-year old is they're running around, they're crashing into things, they're at risk of drawing on the walls, and they can get under your skin. And sometimes you need a little quiet. And I was sitting there and I was reading to my son before bed, and I just wanted it to be done. I just wanted to take a shower and go to sleep. And I'm sitting there and I'm getting ready to put him in his bed. And I get up and I'm getting ready to leave, and he just starts saying, "One more, one more, one more book." And my gut instinct is, I'm tired, I want to be done. And then it clicked in my brain, and I think God just had to put that message in there right when I needed to hear it, is there is going to be a day where he isn't going to say one more, and I'm going to get exactly what I want, where it will be quiet, where he will be out of the home, it'll be quiet, things will be clean. And this is a season of my life where this routine of reading to him and having him always want to play with me and always want to be around me, it's not forever. And I do not want to look back on my life, and no one on their deathbed is going to sit there and say, "Oh, I wish I spent less time with my kids. I wish that
right,
I wish that I had binged that one show just a little bit longer." Most folks, when they interview people that are in hospice or are near the end of their life, they talk about that they spent too much time at work, that they wish that they had been more generous with their time or their wealth towards others, that they had more time with their children. Um, I told myself when I became a father that the song "Cat in the Cradle" was not going to be my experience. It's not going to
yes,
be that I ignore. And so I think what you say is absolutely important. It's not to say that people can't get on our nerves or that sometimes we need decompression time, but the recognition of our responsibilities as parents and what we are called to do, it is it is the most important job that I could ever do, is being a good, present, loving, loyal, devoted father and husband. That is the highest calling, uh, that is below religious devotion, I would say.
yes, yes. Because that calling is actually one where we image our Heavenly Father.
Absolutely.
That's, between that and being married, which is portraying Christ in the church, whether we do it badly or not, that's what it's portraying. So as fathers, we're portraying God the Father. As husbands, to our wives, and as our wives to us, that's portraying Christ in the church. That is an entire religious formation class in and of itself that we present simply just by being, by the nature of the relationships that we have. So, wow. Well, the last thing I want to touch on, and this is from a book review that you did a while back that relates to this, from Rod Dreher's Benedict Option, which I read years ago and appreciated, and actually appreciate even more now than I did when it came out back in 2017. But he talks about
I actually
the
have it
need
right
for.
here. Sorry to cut you
There you
off, but
go.
it was
Oh,
before my I am sorry for cutting you off, but it's so funny you mentioned that because before my mother came to pick up my son for their grandmother grandson day together today, she was talking about looking at like interesting books that apply scripture, and I just so happened to have it here on the table, and I'm sorry, what a coincidence. But continue.
Oh no, but it was formational because I remember when Rod first started writing about this back in 2010 or 2009 on his blog, back when it was on BeliefNet
Hmm.
is what it was called. It was just a religious blogging system that different people had blogs on. Anyway, it's a long time ago, but he was talking about that, and he said, "I think I may need to write a book about this." And I thought, okay, and it excited me then, and it but all that leading to this point is that as we are striving to do this in our individual homes, what is the role then of homes working together in a community? Because that is a pivotal part
Hmm.
of Christian formation. It can't God did not make us to live in abject isolation where we don't have any interaction with people. Kind of like the old homeschool joke where we say, the homeschool family comes out from under the rock once a week to go to church and then they go crawl back in. You know, you don't want to be like that. And I can say that because I'm a homeschool dad. So,
Hmm.
that's, so I know what that's like. So you don't want to be that. And we must see the need for working together. So just talk about, considering what Dreher wrote years ago. What is the role of a community in the formation of young, of people towards their Father in heaven?
So it is a cliche to say that it takes a village, but it absolutely does. I'm reminded, oddly enough, this is before I was born, but I always think back to what Ronald Reagan actually said in his farewell address at the end of his presidency, where he's talking about what people are learning about America and patriotism and one's country. And he says, if you didn't get it in the home, you got it from the neighbor down the street, you got it from the guy across town that was in World War II. You got it from the priest, the pastor, the rabbi, the wherever. Is if we are called to be part of God's community, whether you are a professing Christian or otherwise, if you are simply people that exist geographically near each other, there are values and virtues that come from that. And even on a more materialistic kind of selfish perspective, our society would be well served if in a local community you have multiple homeschooling families operating together, where the mom or the dad of one family who is an expert on something can be a resource point for all of the children in the community. Where it's easier when you have the five homeschooling moms, let's say, that live on the same street, all the kids get together and they're all cooking a meal together and they're learning about how recipes work and they're learning about responsibility. Is It provides spiritual nourishment, socialization, emotional support, and it forms those communal ties, because a man on his own living on an island cannot accomplish nearly as much as a group of like-minded individuals that are sharing a goal.
Yes, yes. So then to close, I'll just mention the last bold point in your, and I mean, as in, not, I mean, it was bold of you to say, but it was a point that you literally had in bold in your Substack article, which was rebel with reverence. So that's a great line that I hope that we can all practice, the type of rebelling not against our God appointed authorities, but rebelling against the cultural expectations that would pull us down. And instead, we look up and we resist the downward pull and instead pursue higher things.
Mhm.
So, we maintain our reverence. So, again, I've been interviewing Ryan Pugliese. His Substack is called Pugliese's Paideia, and of course, I'll have links to that and this particular article in the notes. Really great writing, and Ryan, thank you again. It's been a lot of fun to get to talk today, and I appreciate everything, and hopefully we'll get to talk again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.